I don't know if I should make this recording an addendum and apologize for some of the elements in my last recording on the topic that this is would be the addendum to, or if I should just start anew. I was running out of energy after probably making too many recordings on the same day and recordings about other topics that my mind was somewhat scattered, and I had not fully mulled over how to, in a condensed fashion, go through the very set of complicated issues. But I did, I think, even though right at the end I kind of lost my bearings completely, sort of just thinking outside the box. I was literally trying to pick up on every single thread in the Ukrainian complexity. Uh, Now, let's say, withstanding all the things that I discussed, and I did try to discuss things far afield, things that seem to be, there's almost a kind of element of cognitive dissonance because, you do actually have to think through things from every angle. And there are essentially at least three angles. There's the American side, there's the Russian side, and there's the Ukrainian side. And in some sense, one of the things that I started to get into, or that I didn't finish the thread, which is the ethnically cleansing, the war within Ukraine, the civil war within Ukraine, in terms of the ethnic cleansing of the Ukrainians against the Russian speaking peoples in Ukraine. And this has largely been forgotten and ignored by Western media in framing the Ukrainian issue. It's very telling that essentially ethnic cleansing seems to, it's interesting. In the world today, ethnic cleansing is the most contentious issue because, essentially, if you do ethnic cleansing slowly enough, no one gives a fuck, And it's true that I think that if you ethnically cleanse people very, very, very slowly, in some sense, it's ambiguous if it should be called ethnic cleansing or not. But technically, lots of things count as ethnic cleansing, even things that are completely internationally legal and above board. You're just encouraging people who speak a certain language that you don't want in your vicinity. If you pay them to move away, maybe that could be a kind of ethnic cleansing. So it's sort of how it's done, I think, is important. So because this is the ethnic cleansing can very much be confused with things like structural oppression, and then you open the door to all of that nonsense and all of that sort of malarkey and interpretation and relativistic, nihilistic, immoral, skeptical, scapegoating games and roundabouts and circuses. So you can. So yeah, I realize that the phrase ethnic cleansing is open to interpretation and certainly moral abuse. Okay, so I just want to put that there. But when I say that there's ethnic cleansing that was going on in Ukraine, I'm talking about the illegal kind. I'm talking about the immoral kind. And Ukraine, because it is an inverted commas democracy, has gotten away with this, although it can also be historically contextualized so that one can be at least slightly sympathetic to the Ukrainian speaking peoples to some degree, but so I can be sensitive and somewhat sympathetic. But at the same time, I'm also slightly aghast that Yanis Varoufakis, and I'm sorry if I'm slightly pronouncing his name incorrectly, he has tried to school me how to pronounce his name even, and I've got too many names in my head to remember people's accents well enough to emulate them when I'm saying their names. So anyway, I preemptively apologize, but he really is a gifted orator. He can speak well on an issue. He in the public space can exemplify temperance like no other. It really is a gift. It really is a gift. And you can see that he was surfing the waves of Western bad faith like a champ, like a surfing world champion. Okay, but sorry, I'm talking about the interview on I don't actually know what it's called now. because the lockdown is over, isn't it? But the unheard YouTube channel, that had the lockdown TV. I guess I'll just call it unheard. Yeah, that's what it's called, unheard. On the unheard YouTube channel, brilliant host, very, the very high quality exposition of issues, in some sense putting the zeitgeist to the interviewee, in a very clinical, broad way. Anyway, putting the issues to the people that can answer the issues of the day. Very high quality journalism. Okay, and it's interesting because I don't like the format a little bit, because in my view I would want it to be more. I mean, obviously this is a personal thing, and so I mean, in terms of my taste, I like people to have more developed views that they put to people, rather than just sort of testing them against the zeitgeist. But that is a completely different format. It's a completely different genre of journalism, and unheard certainly is an important. So although personally, I think that I would almost like, there's this beautiful discourse by some people in the Daily Friend. They do this podcast called Two Crickets and a Thorn Tree, and they were talking about sort of wet noodle centrists, and sort of Gabriel has this very interesting little song and dance, that little dissertation that he has on his radical centrism, because he considers himself a radical centrist. And let me see if I can recapitulate the argument. I mean, I think I've replicated this form of thinking and expressed it in other forms. But the idea that he made a really good critique of Mitt Romney as being this kind of wet noodle, because all he does basically is work out what is the popular opinion on the left, what is the popular opinion of the right, and then he kind of like averages them out like on a statistical chart. So he doesn't like reason his position, he just does it based on popularity stats. He just literally, and he's very intelligent. So it's like, he doesn't provide reasons for why he votes what he votes for. He just is basically sort of the centrist glue holding things together. But because he doesn't actually have any like coherent reasoning behind any of his positions, it's like he's not even doing politics at that point. He's like, he doesn't have a coherent position. So he's just a kind of, he's just a sort of weather vane of the zeitgeist. He's just a kind of unthinking sort of anyway. And the idea is that that's why the world is fucked, is because people who are in politics that do that are, selling us to hell in a handbasket, or they're taking us there because they're not actually doing their job of let's say, developing the culture into reason and understanding, where things are actually capable of being settled in a way that is respectable and coherent. They're not part of the process of precipitating a steady solution. In some sense, they just want to win support, or win friends and influence people, or some shit. They're playing a game that essentially has anti-integrity, but obviously there's also a market for that in people's constituencies. So it's like it's hideous that democracy is beholden to those kinds of games that people can play in some sense, but it's also a reflection of the fact that democracy is essentially helmed by people who, quite frankly, it would be better if they didn't vote, if they sort of selected themselves out of the voting pool, because they essentially are evil people with very bad mentalities. But obviously, you can't. I mean, I have, that's my personal opinion. I wouldn't. It might be. I think I can advance that as my personal opinion, that I would discourage evil people from voting. I don't think that's necessarily a controversial opinion, though some people might have some convoluted philosophical idea about why that's an immoral message to put in the public sphere. But anyway, obviously it's a bit of a useless opinion, because it's sort of, well, the people who are evil wouldn't care to follow that prescript, would they? That prescribed activity would not fall into something that they would be responsive to, sort of, because by definition, evil people, uh, they don't incline themselves towards the good. They would rather think of themselves as righteous and virtuous, and or at least publicly they would do so, even if privately they are lying to themselves on some level at least, or at least are so enamored in their own pretense and pretending that uh, to actually measure themselves against any kind of internal rigor and integrity is a hope not worth having, i.e., we call these people evil. So anyway, it's a bit of a waste of time to try to publicize that rule in society. But anyway, it's not a rule. It's just an opinion. So anyway, I'm just basically saying how facile it is. Um, there's would be no reason to have a campaign around that truism. Evil. It would be better if evil people didn't vote, if they self-selected themselves out of the voting booth. Anyway, maybe that's the problem, is that many people, they don't know their own moral status, and so they actually have a kind of timid humility, and that keeps them out of the voting booth. So that's the problem with democracy, is that maybe it's sort of it would be better to go with the Australian thing of forcing everyone into the booth, because then at least then they would have to actively spoil their ballots if they didn't want to participate. But at least then that maybe the general mood would be better recorded. The let's say the collective wisdom would be better represented under those circumstances. Anyway, so it's interesting. I come up with the truism would be better if evil people didn't vote, and the pragmatic solution might actually be, the pragmatic optimization might be that it's better to conscript people into forcing them to vote, like the Australians do it. But I do think that although pragmatically the Australian solution is ideal, it is also not dignified to force people into a voting booth. So although it is pragmatically optimized, I think ethically it's actually, so utilitarianism can be at odds with my ethics. So, what I consider to be optimally utilitarian, I don't ethically endorse. Anyway, it just shows the complexity of, being intelligent and ethical. Um, of well, what should one make pronouncements over? What should one publicly endorse and not? And there's a kind of diplomacy in that anyway. And you can understand that maybe then Mitt Romney is actually more sophisticated than people might know. Maybe he actually he harbors ideas about the American political system that are just, they're not exactly private, but they're not exactly public. Maybe you should ask him about it and maybe work out what his strategy is. Maybe it's more sophisticated than it appears, and it is perhaps a bit clandestine, which is also maybe slightly strange for a democratic political figure. Not that I mean democratic in the sense that for a political figure in a democracy to have a kind of two-faced persona, or at least a subterfuge, a persona that is a kind of political subterfuge that is paper thin, and that there's obviously something else going on behind the scenes. It's anyway, it's a mystery. It's a mystery machine, maybe. Anyway, sorry, I've gotten all the way off the topic. I'm trying to talk about Ukraine. So now let me get into my harsh words to say about Ukraine, because there are lots of harsh words to be had. People say, okay, let's not talk about America. Let's not talk about Russia. Let's talk about what the Ukrainians want, and then and that's, when people want to talk geopolitics and they don't want to talk balance of power, they don't want to talk history, they don't want to talk Who cares about what the Americans think? What do the Ukrainians think? Well, the Ukrainians are essentially at war with themselves because Ukraine should be a neutral country, not for all the good reasons that Yanis Varoufakis said about the issue, for many more reasons that he actually didn't state that I thought are even morally stronger. Because although he did quite fatherly in a way say, look, I'm allowed to have my opinion that Ukraine should have been a neutral country. Obviously, it should have been a neutral country because of its own internal demographics, for fuck's sake. It's one thing to say that you have good historical reasons to be resentful against Russia, and especially, if you look at Crimea. And if you don't want to if you don't want to tolerate how Crimea was taken and absorbed into Russia, if you don't want to tolerate that, and you don't want to tolerate it with any kind of geopolitical nuance, and you want to be resentful against be resentful against Russia and how Ukraine was a Russian puppet, kind of controlled satellite, can certainly sympathize with that. That how Ukraine was run so corruptly by essentially oligarchs, which it's still not fully exhumed from or whatever. But I don't want to be too harsh because I don't know to what degree these things were done in good faith in some sense, or when I say good faith, maybe Ukraine just wanted to look like that they were ethnically cleansing their Russian-speaking population in order to provoke Russia into cross a line, so that then all of this nonsense can happen that really helps the American military-industrial complex because they're going to be restocking a lot of Javelin missiles. But the element of this, I think Russia could have been the bad guy. Russia could have very easily have been the complete bad guy in this situation, but Ukraine fucked that up because of their ethnic cleansing of their own people. They were ethnically cleansing their own fucking people just because they spoke a different language, which was the same as their historical nightmare. You want to say, well, in history, this country has given us nightmares that we still live with today. So we're allowed to ethnically cleanse. I mean, that's what's happening to the whites in South Africa. I mean, the ANC, you can take the political organization off the terrorist watch list, but you can't take the terrorism out of the political organization. I mean, the ANC essentially is still in a kind of terrorist mode. I mean, they kind of see themselves as a cross between the Soviet socialists, revolutionaries, and sort of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They're kind of, whereas they kind of haven't kept up with the times because they don't, they've kind of ignored the fact that even the PLO at the moment is basically radical Islamic. It has completely merged with the radical Islamic ideology, and they've completely detached from the fact that the Soviet Union is no longer Leninist or communist at all. So the ANC has kind of it's got an ideological worldview which doesn't even exist anymore in the rest of the world, where they're still trying to burn the lamp. And so, when the ANC tries to sort of talk about the Ukrainian issue, I mean, I think they're just kind of mirroring the Chinese stance, which I do actually respect. If you see what China has said about the situation, it just seems eminently reasonable from a third-person perspective. Very weighed and measured in terms of all the factors that are involved in the situation. And, you really have to... This is, according to the current media cycle and zeitgeist, this is verboten to say, but Ukraine has done this to itself for its own... And in some sense, Ukraine deserves this for its ethnic cleansing of its own people. I really want to say that I care very little about what you do to shoot yourself in the foot. If you want to say it doesn't matter what Russia wants, it doesn't matter what America wants, it's what the Ukrainians want, well, they deserve what's happening to them, I'm sorry to say. If you're not going to sort of understand that Ukraine should have been a neutral country, then you're a fucking retard. And you're also immoral. You're ethically. If you want to say mind your. No, no, no. You're not allowed to have an opinion because you're a foreigner. So mind your own business. Ukrainians can have an opinion. Maybe the Russians can have an opinion. They're having an argument with Russia right now. That's what matters. You're not allowed to have an opinion if you're an outsider. Okay, well, I mean, if that's going to be your attitude, I guess Well, I'm sorry. Then please ignore what I had to say. I'll. So, I mean, I'm certainly not involved directly. I'm not. I'm not. It's got nothing to do with me. I'm talking as a neutral observer, and because I have ears and I have eyes, and I have a brain and I can think. Um, But I mean, you could say that I'm basically a little bit biased, maybe because I'm sensitive. Maybe I'm overly sensitive to ethnic cleansing because I feel like I'm being ethnically cleansed, and the world doesn't give a fuck. The world doesn't give a fuck if you're being ethnically cleansed. If you're the right color of skin, it doesn't matter. No one gives a fuck, right? So because the Russian-speaking Ukrainian people are white, when they're being ethnically cleansed, when their language is being suppressed and their children aren't being taught in their own fucking language, and they're being essentially provoked and bullied. Uh, Look, I mean, again, I can be sympathetic in the context, but you don't treat your own people like that. Yes, the Ukrainian speaking population of Ukraine is a slight majority, or at least is a decent majority, but it's not as if the Russian speaking people in Ukraine are they're not a tiny minority. They're like, I don't actually know what the numbers are, but I think it's like at least 30%. It might even be higher than 30%. That's a significant size of the population. You can't just say, we don't like your language, so you change your language to the majority. You can't force people to do that. Now, in South Africa, we have a completely different situation. I mean, we could have a multilingual state. The government is just a really bad government that steals all the money and corrupt as hell. And they can just defer all the blame and scapegoat everything onto the white minority population because they can just say, well, you see, they're not poor like us. So, like, if you look at the majority of black people, the majority of black people in this country are poor. Therefore, the majority of white people in this country that haven't left are still surviving a little bit, and they're not as poor as our majority. Therefore, there's not equality in the country. Never mind the fact that, like, the people at the top of the pyramid are all black, essentially, um, at least in terms of numbers. Uh, Never mind, that the poverty in this country can largely be put at the feet of the ANC. Never mind, people conflate historical causation with moral causation when, everything that is wrong in this country. I mean, imagine if we had had 30 years of decent growth because we actually had someone managing the economy, or we had a political party that was managing the economy that wasn't constantly trying to steal everything and sabotage everything so that they could continue their slash and burn ethnic cleansing, essentially. Um, because they still basically style themselves as an occupied. They literally use the same propaganda as the PLO. Now let me just say that maybe there's an argument that the propaganda of the PLO is somewhat applicable. I don't think that you can make that argument in South Africa, although you can if you kind of have a Marxist, anti-capitalist kind of ideological framing. Then it becomes easier to do that in the same way that the social justice, identity politics, sort of systemic oppression argument can just always defer blame onto a generalization, onto an identity faction. It's fascism. It's like, blame the Jews for everything. Blame the capitalists for everything, you know. So it's not the government's fault, it's the white monopoly capital. That's literally the fascist slogan that is used in this ethnic cleansing campaign. Uh, an ethnic cleansing campaign that, by the way, doesn't just destroy white people's lives, it destroys the lives of the poor, it destroys the lives of the future of all of our children. You know, it dwindles the resource base, it destroys education, it makes people stupid. You know, it is a morally corrupting ideological disguise for corrupt, thieving politicians that people don't vote out of power because the people are morally corrupt. You know, the people are getting what they vote for, and they like how they are being lied to. They prefer their hate and their vengeance and their betrayal of the South African constitutional conception of social justice has been twisted by all of this neo-American democratic moral gerrymandering, you know, because the American legal system and justice system combined with the political system is a toxic concoction, and our law in South Africa was actually perfect. It really was. It was the best legal system in the world, but it was essentially corrupted by American academics that were imported. Legal experts from America were imported in order to invent judgments. They actually taught our judges how to write their racialist ideological bullshit. And we are where we are now today because the law has been institutionally corrupted. That's the true systemic corruption of our age. In order to promote the lie of systemic oppression, which is the best umbrella and disguise for a corrupt elite that you can imagine. So we live in a strange situation. It's kind of Nazi Germany, but still in Weimar liberal clothing, you know, wolf in sheep's clothing, you know. So we're kind of Nazi Germany in an African wolf in sheep's clothing kind of disguise, you know. And if you don't get what I'm saying that the ANC is basically a pack of black fascists, and you know, President Cyril Ramaphosa has this wonderful two-faced game that he plays, where you know he pretends that he's working against his own party while the frog gets boiled, you know. So it's this wonderful, you know, they've found the perfect way to ethnically cleanse in view of the world, and no one notices. In fact, when it happens in Ukraine, the Western media won't even show that part of the story. Like, Russia is just a bad guy. Why the fuck did Russia invade Ukraine? It couldn't have been because of how the Russian speaking peoples in Ukraine were being treated. Like, it's not even in the news cycle. It's not even in. It's fucking ethnic cleansing. It's in the fucking Geneva Convention. You know? Like, and it's just not mentioned. It's just verboten. You can't even fucking utter the word. I mean, it's fucking ethnic cleansing. I mean, it's insane. It's utterly insane. But, you know, I guess if you cared about ethnic cleansing and you understood, you know, what it meant in context and in a moral context, then maybe you would look at South Africa and you would say, well, that's actually ethnic cleansing. If there ever was one. It's just that sort of, it's a weird kind of ethnic cleansing that is also destroying other people at the same time. In some sense, you could say you know, it's sort of the ethnic cleansing of the middle class or the ethnic cleansing of the rich. And essentially that, you know, because white monopoly capital or white privilege is synonymous with just being middle class, basically. It's class warfare. I mean, essentially. It's class warfare in a psychological mindfuckery, you know, of, you know, heteronormativity is genociding trans people. You know, it's that kind of logic. Like, if you are part of a culture that promotes any identity having a differential outcome from any other identity, then you are ethnically cleansing that, so, essentially the social justice warrior movement has essentially sterilized the concept of ethnic cleansing because it's adopted it as its fundamental model, right? And yes, it is actually a problematic concept in that it can be fuzzy, because there are some technically, in some sense, there are some forms of ethnic cleansing which on a structural, technical level, you can say, okay, well, this is actually ethnically cleansing this area, but it's not killing anyone. And in fact, it's actually promoting people to do what's even in their own interest, and it's even helping incentivize them to go find a different place to live in that would even be, like what happens if people are living in a horrible condition, they're living in a horrible place, and you actually say, here's another language, or here's education that you didn't have before, here's this, here's that. And then somebody else says, but now you've just destroyed a traditional way of life. Haven't you ethnically cleansed that traditional way of life? This is the problematic term, right? This is, so it's ambiguous. You can project things onto it. You can interpret things. But I mean, really, if you're going to be that kind of nihilistic and misanthropic and skeptical and play technical word games and language games, go fuck yourself. I'm talking about real ethnic cleansing. Real ethnic cleansing. Like, have you lost sight of the ground beneath your fucking feet? What is the name of this planet called? Where are we? We're on planet Earth. We have one planet. One planet. Do people realize that there's ethnic cleansing happening on this planet? That there's ethnic cleansing that was going on in Ukraine. And it was fucking nasty. A democracy does not ethnically cleanse its own population in that nasty way that Ukraine was doing to its Russian-speaking people. And the Western media just gives Russia a fucking... Sorry. Wow, I just misspoke. The Western media gives Ukraine a fucking free pass while it piles all the blame and, who's been a bad boy and moral sanctimony against Russia. Against Russia. Just because Russia, is supposedly headed by a bad boy. But, let's not even look at the history of that, which I did in my other recording. Anyway, so this is the fuck up that we live in. This is how people have fucked up our planet. This is there are people out there with shitty fucking ideas, and you ask them why do you have this idea? What is the reason that you continue to persist in this belief and in this course of action, and what is the context of this? And you just actually, let's just space it out and contextualize it and look at the other side and look at every side, not just look at the other side for looking at the other side's sake. Let's look at each side, on its own merits and its own demerits, and come up to some rational, reasonable conclusions, and then fit the conclusions together, and then work from there and resolve from there and reconcile from there, and see what can be done and see what can be concluded. And I mean, if you want to skip to the part of the story where Russia is the bad guy, but you're going to completely ignore that Ukraine was fucking ethnically cleansing its own people while still retaining the good grace of the West and considering itself a fucking democracy, a democracy that ethnically cleanses its own people. Well, obviously being a democracy is not fucking good enough. Obviously, Ukraine doesn't have a constitution worth a shit, okay? Doesn't have a legal justice system worth a shit. But it can get away with this because it has a fucking democracy aura. Does it have a democracy halo? Who fucking gave it this halo? The American media system. The legacy media gave it this halo. Why? Because of the military-industrial complex in America that has some kind of clandestine idea about how it's going to depose Putin and put Russia on the back end, of history, or sort of. Now, I don't want to take sides between Russia and America, because I do think that that is a kind of code, that is a historical codependency. I've already gone into the complexity of that in the pre-recording. I think this will be an addendum, but it will be a separate recording. It'll be Ukraine Part 1 prelude and Ukraine Part 2 analysis of, like actual ethical moral shit, like, or what should we say about it. So now I'm making my thoughts plain now about what should be said about it. Maybe I'm just, I guess people can say, well, you're just being a greedy bastard because you just want people to care about what's happening to you in your country. I mean, I guess, well, people are open to their aspersions. I mean, I think that I have proved my impartiality. I mean, I'm a judgmental and sensitive person. I'm judgmental against everyone. I'm very fucking critical of America. I'm very fucking critical of continental Europe. I can't think of any country that I have not been really fucking critical of. Maybe Japan. Maybe I'm a bit of a Japanophile. What do they call them? Nihongophile. No, what's it? I don't know what the term is. Gaijin. Gaijin, uh, um, uh, no, I don't know. I can't remember what they're called. Mm, a foreigner obsessed with the Japanese romance, kingdom fairy tale story, of anyway. But I've even contextualized that, with against China, because China has its charm. It really does. That's it's this weird thing. I saw this wonderful quote from an African politician. Oh man, I wish I could remember his name, but the quote was amazing. It said, I don't know which country he's from. I would have to, you see, if I tell it now, I'm just going to guess based on how he looked, but I'm going to guess that he was sort of Kenyan. He looks a bit Kenyan to me, so I'm going to guess he's from that area. Oh man, I just typecast someone based on their physical features. He's probably like, he was probably, you see, people in Africa, sorry, I shouldn't generalize. People in South Africa are really ignorant about the politics in the rest of Africa. Um, so I must apologize myself. He's probably from Ghana. I think he might be from like a French speaking African country. That's kind of how he looks to me. But that's you see how superficial I can just project things onto people based on how they look. Anyway, his quote was ingenious. The quote was, "In Japan, if someone finds out about your corruption in Japan, you commit suicide. If they find out about your corruption in China, they kill you. If they find out about your corruption in Europe, they imprison you." I can't remember if there was another line. And then it said, "In Africa, if they find out about your corruption, you offer yourself up for election." You submit your candidacy in the next election. Sort of showing that, there's this. It's interesting. There's this kind of amoral appetite that, sort of, uh, there's this kind of cultural laxity that people just don't care that much, it seems. I mean, it might be a thing that, law is something that is a function of a nation. I do think that to understand law, you actually have to have experience in a nation. And to properly understand law, it can't just be the decree of the king, it has to be above the king as well, or above the governance structure. This is why America is a fundamentally psychologically fucked up place. It has this Luciferian air around it because justice is the imagination of the electorate, which is essentially democracy is the king of America. And anyway, this is my whole spiritual critique of America, is because if you have a king, you are cursed fundamentally. If you believe that you should be governed by a king, the problem is that your king will always be a source, therefore, of prophecy. And so you will be saddled with the disgusting spiritual question, is your king one of the prophets? And it doesn't matter what the answer to that question is. If you have that question in your mind, it is spiritually poisonous. Because if the collective or the democracy or the king or the culture or whatever is the thing that is the king that is providing governance over you, if you believe that that thing is extolling the gift of prophecy, is the holder of the gift of prophecy, has the gift of prophecy raveled inside of it, then the gift of prophecy is not available to your discernment. It's not in your, I was about to say it's not in your world, but to use the doctrinal language more precisely, the gift of prophecy is locked into the world and you can't experience it on the earth. It's beyond the earth, it's locked in the world. It's no longer in your natural accessible reach. It's in the inaccessible reach of the world to understand. Sorry, I'm using spiritual jargon. You see, it's a bit technical. It's a bit complicated. Anyway, so you have to understand sort of the difference between the earth and the world. The earth is a real place. The world is an imagined illusion, but it's also an illusion that can be shared with other people. And so it's a form of argument, but it's an argument that has no ultimate resolution. It's just an argument that continues itself along. So it's kind of, in the end, it amounts to nothing because it's like a giant circular argument. It's a giant tautology. It just keeps on reinforcing its own fractal evolution. You know, like what a fractal is? That's a mathematical thing that you can keep on throwing numbers into a fractal and you're looking at the same thing. You're looking at the same formula, but it has an infinite number of permutations. It has an infinite number of something that looks different that amounts to the same the same question that underlies it. So it's just, instead of finding the answer to a question, you just keep on asking the same question in slightly different variations, right? So you're actually treading water. You're actually just in the middle of the sea. This is why the world is often spiritually spoken about as a sea, because the sea has a crest and it has a trough. A little wave forms and then it goes back down again. This is because the sea is just a big mass of water that collectively is being magnetic, or no, sorry, not magnetic, probably a bit of magnetism, but because there's got salt in it. But it's basically just gravity. The moon's gravity is working on it. Maybe the Earth is spinning. Maybe that's doing a little bit of something. I don't know all the physics. I don't know all the math of all the physics. But basically, it is a container expressing a weird mimicry of life. It's almost a mockery of life. It's where all the life of all the world has ended up, in the sea. Because when something dies, eventually maybe it burns, and after you burn something that was alive, the only thing that comes out at the end of it, after you burn it enough and enough and enough, is the salt is the only thing that's left of it, and that salt maybe finds its way into the water of the sea. And so all the former living things of the world are locked into the salt of the sea. And then it looks like it's kind of alive because, The tide goes in, the tide goes out. It's always moving, it's always moving. But is it alive? Or is it just the container of environmental conditions and weather and forces that are predominantly coming from the moon, coming from maybe rotation and coming, so it's all just, it's interesting how that's also a metaphor for the feminine. The sun is the masculine and the moon is the feminine, and the sun is very far away, but it actually creates all of the life on the planet, and the moon is very close, and it just kind of gives us the seasons and the tides and the mimicry that makes the sea look like it's alive when it's actually not alive. It looks like it's this very complicated system, but it's just, it's something that we haven't controlled yet because, we haven't grown up and, subdue the earth and replenish it, there's this, do we have the power to have mastery over these things? This is the sort of the difference between misanthropy and hating humanity, hating people, hating the understanding, hating the, just wanting to become one with the sea and just go with the flow and just be carried and just go on a voyage or go on a, I don't know. So you have lots of people who are one with the sea, That's how they see themselves, at least, or that's how they question the world, as if the world should bring them the next chapter of the voyage. They're not the protagonist of the story. They're not trying to develop the self-realized Christ consciousness, uh, the proper understanding of God and life and ethics. People they don't want to know because they have other concerns. Or maybe, they would get to that. They're still in the middle of some mystery that they're trying to, I mean, you see, the difference is that some people, they're addicted to mysteries and they just want to find better mysteries to lose themselves inside of. And some people actually want to finish mysteries. And so, obviously, when you learn that actually the point of mysteries is that they should be finished, maybe it'll take you quite a while to empty your bowl because you still have a lot of mysteries that you're currently mulling over, and you don't just want to drop them all while you're in the middle of processes that they're not going to be you're going to be languished in the aftermath of unfinished business. So put your affairs in order, please. Don't do things haphazardly. Don't do things dangerously, and etc., etc. But anyway, so I mean, this is the issue of diplomacy and politics and geopolitics. Even is that you have to know which demon to sort of quell first, or which bone to which bone do you. So I'm using some English idioms that might be hardly accessible to some people. That maybe you have a bone to pick with some people as you are dropping. Sorry, there's another idiom that has bones in it that I want to refer to. So sometimes you have to pick some fights with some people, so that you can, in the proper order, you can resolve other things. Anyway, it's a bit of a symphony, it's a bit of an orchestral feat of man. Man, oh man, oh man. Oh man, oh man. Oh man. And what will we learn? Oh man, I need to update my psychology theory because I've come up with some interesting new realizations and understandings and things like that. Or at least some interesting speculations about properly integrating these things. This came from listening to some of my earlier recordings when I was still putting pieces together, and I still haven't come up with a really condensed way of summarizing my model, because it is a lot to see. In fact, the problem is that I need to start exploring it directly, not abstractly through the model. So I'm very close to that stage. And that will confirm things experientially, that will, rather empirically, that will put me back into empiricism, which will put me in a firm foothold. So my raw notes, although they are slightly embarrassing, because I have to say this is just speculation at this point, I think I am facilitating to the point of empirical verification, which will also open the way to psychometric. So finally, my theoretical phase of my research is going to be at an end, and I will move into a much better dynamic phase of both a combination of synthesizing treatment, psychometry, and better understanding, integrated understanding of I don't know how to put this, sort of actual psychological uh, mechanics, phenomenology, actual, proper, real understanding of everything that is going on phenomenologically in the uh, in the subject of psychology, which will be the queen of the sciences, which will be the fountain of teaching, through which people can. Let me just. I don't have energy to do justice to extolling the contents of this, but let's just say, just as a low resolution summary, that it's going to be something like, not exactly like this, but as a symbol, as a low resolution symbol, it'll be something like the sorting hat in Hogwarts in the Harry Potter story. It'll be something that's what the Queen of the Sciences will be able to have as one of its fruits in terms of how it can offer to people uh, not exactly guidance, but a methodology of sorting things, of being able to model and plot where they are, but also with enough nuance that it can show the terra incognita and the ambiguity in the model as well. So you can, it'll show you, yes, you can model exactly where you're at, but it'll also tell you, in some sense, how much potential is roughly, or depending on the kinds of potentials, because obviously different kinds of potentials are not going to be, what's the word, trackable in the same paradigmatic dimension. So so you say like, okay, well, if you want to understand, that there are perhaps multiple ways to model to sort out where it is you are. So in some sense, it's just it'll just be like a kind of a potential touchstone. Is that even the right word? I think it's the right word. Not sure what a touchstone technically is, but it's like a guide. It's like a I don't know. You see, all these analogies fall short because they can also be too amorally ambiguous. You know, it's kind of like a remote control that has preset heuristics and protocols and functions that are also capable of communicating the moral content of those pre-programmed. So it's kind of it's a combination of pedagogy as well as guidance, so that you can understand the pedagogy in such a way that you're not just that you are actually increasing your understanding as well as your knowledge. You're not just kind of creating a disintegrated self um, excuse me for not. I mean, this is actually an interesting thing to be talking about, but I don't want to strain my voice forever here. But so let me just get straight to the summary of what I was saying. Is that you know, it'll be like having the tool to underline where you are fragmenting your intellect and how to reunify or holistically sail your way back to integration and integrity. So it'll be both the capability of the panacea, but it won't necessarily be a panacea for everyone, because, you know, you can't, you know, it's still going to be a free country. You can't force things down people's throats, but at least there'll probably be enough people with a good head on their shoulders that at least they won't fall to the misanthropic games of malevolent idiots, you know. Anyway, was that too much of a cartoonish vision that I'm sharing? But anyway, to have to phrase it in the kind of binary of good cop, bad cop is a bit it's a bit crude. But anyway, I'm tired and I want to rest my voice. Ha ha ha.